All right, so today's lecture is all about making sense of qualitative data. We're going to think about your qualitative data from your open response questions on your program evaluation tool in a more scientific way than you're probably used to. And our end goal is to not only think about this qualitative data scientifically, but then to translate that qualitative data into quantitative data. And then we'll talk about ways that we can graph, visualize, and write up some of these results together. So in doing this, we're going to take you from square one, and we're going to first talk about what coding is, the different types of coding, go through a bunch of different examples of it. I have some case examples for you. Then we'll talk about a step-by-step 5-part process for coding your program evaluation data, and we'll go through that with examples again. Then we'll talk about writing these results, both your raw qualitative results, so your themes, your big primary themes that come out of that, and then also those translated qualitative results together in one cohesive narrative in a short paragraph. And that's really where we come into not only translating the qual into the quant, but bridging those together into some meaningful, substantive narrative, a synthesis of your qualitative data together. All right. So, with that said, in thinking scientifically about your written response data, which is your qualitative data on your program evaluation tool, there is a method to analyzing written text during an action research study, and we call that coding. So coding is used for action research, but it's used across a host of different methods in research, not just action research. So a code has several main approaches. Coding has several main approaches, and it involves assigning a short word or phrase that categorizes the participant's response. And the code can be used to summarize the main point or secondary points in a sentence. So it can also be used to summarize multiple sentences from one participant. So you could be summarizing the main point or secondary points of an entire sentence. You could also use to summarize multiple sentences from one participant into one theme. And really the goal of coding is to assign the same codes repeatedly for similar responses across your participants. So once the same codes appear across multiple participants, it's then possible to pick out the codes that occur most frequently. And that's where we start to get into quantifying your qualitative data. And we can then refer to the responses that were given a particular code in order to describe the variation and experiences within that code. So what I mean by that is you'll likely assign the same code across participants, but it's being assigned to different things. So you're assigning the code of supporting soft skills to one participant, but they're talking about workplace behaviors while the other is talking about interview skills, right? So these codes that you assign will have different variations of what they're being assigned to, and by doing it across people, it allows you to develop a rich description of what that practice looks like across your participants' responses. So there are a couple different types of codes that are relevant to what we're doing here. In your research this semester, there are many other different types of coding, but we're going to focus just on the 3 that are most relevant to the work that you're doing this semester. So for action research in transition specifically, the following types are most useful for us. So it's literature-based codes, and these are created before you see any of your data. So these would be created now before you've collected and you see your program evaluation data. And they're based directly upon literature from your literature analysis. So that means that these codes are made directly from your 2.2 of your organizer, your literature analysis in your organizer. And they are directly related to how you broke down sub-practices, or as we call operationalized, your independent variable. And you should use practices identified in your literature analysis as codes for your studies this semester. We're going to be doing this. So for example, let's say that in my literature analysis, I had pulled out, like our previous example we were just talking about a moment ago, supporting soft skills, right? And then sub-practices within supporting soft skills included interview skills, workplace behavior related to confidentiality and physical, physical space, personal space, communication skills, right? Conflict resolution. So imagine those things are in my literature analysis. I might create a literature-based code out of one or more of those. So perhaps my literature-based code might be teaching interview skills. That could be a literature-based code. So in addition to that type of code that happens before you see any of your data, so we call these a priori because they happen before you collect any of your data or you have any of your information ready to analyze. In contrast to that, there are two different coding approaches that happen once you've already gotten your data and you're looking at it for the first time and those first couple of times. So the two of those are descriptive codes and In-Vivo codes. So descriptive codes are created as you review your data, and this is an interpretation by you where you come up with a word or a short phrase to describe a participant's response. So maybe instead of assigning the literature-based code of teaching interview skills, maybe the participant is explaining how they are doing mock interviews to show young people how to begin an interview, right? How to greet yourself, how to talk about your strengths, that idea of explaining your strengths, your challenges in a strength-based approach, right? So talking about your work experience, all these different things that go into it. So maybe these are not things that are necessarily in the literature, but these are some caveats that your participants are talking about, kind of just explaining the nuances of when they apply this evidence-based practice in the field, what it looks like, right? So like I said, maybe they're saying, oh, we're working with young people to shake hands when they first meet and create eye contact and to talk about their resume, their education, right? To talk about their work experience, paid and unpaid, skills and certifications, to ask questions and such when it goes into a job interview. So maybe they're explaining these different things, and then what you could do if you're doing descriptive codes, you could then assign a word or a phrase to describe that participant's explanation. So instead of writing supporting social skills, I might say emphasis on explaining work experience, right? In contrast to descriptive codes where I'm using my own interpretation to write a word or a short phrase that describes what the participant is talking about, I might use In-Vivo codes, which is where I take a few words or a short passage directly from a section of the data, usually from one person's response, to describe the experience. So rather than interpreting what they say and writing a word or a phrase to describe it, I would pull that phrase out and then I would use that in my write-up. So I would have their direct quote from that participant in order to explain, in this case, in our example here, what supporting social skills within the context of job interviews looks like. So those are our three different types of codes that we'll be using this semester. So let's take some time to look at examples of each one of those and kind of go step by step on how to use these codes in practice. All right, so I want to start off with an example here of a fictitious open-ended response, right? So this is fake data that I've made for our example here. In order to show us what literature-based codes can look like. So remember, when you're developing your literature-based codes, you're pulling directly from your 2.2 of your organizer, from those specific practices that you identified from Rowe and from the additional research article that you had pulled from our different folders in our transition research library on Blackboard. So in this example here, we have a stakeholder talking about how their experiences have been with supporting diverse learners in career and technical education, CTE, right? So maybe I had an open-ended response question asking my stakeholders to talk about what effective practices they've used to support diverse learners in CTE. And if I did that, perhaps I had this response here where they're talking about the use of project-based learning where multiple students are working on a team together and they're using high and low tech modalities that work best for them, giving them opportunities to show what they know with multiple tools for construction and composition in the class and workplace. And the participants talking about how they make sure that students not only learn how to use the tools, but learn how to use us within the context of different competitive jobs and that really technology-driven economy they're going to be entering. So if this is my qualitative data that I have here, then I might include literature-based codes from my literature analysis along the lines of something to do with UDL, right? So maybe my literature analysis revolved around pulling out the core aspects of UDL from some research article and identifying the evidence-based practices or those main categories within UDL. And in doing that, I had one of my a priori, my literature-based codes that happen before I do any of my analysis, right? Maybe one of those was provide multiple means of representation. So if that was my code, then I would want to look through this passage here from my participant and identify words or sentences or a couple sentences that explain to me what providing multiple means of representation looks like according to my participants. So if I were to do that, I might highlight the sentence that talks about multiple team members and project-based learning. I would definitely want to highlight the use of multiple tools for construction and composition, right? That would likely be more in the lines of action and expression related to UDL, so that might be another literature-based code that I have. Teaching students how to use tools and providing content in multiple modalities, right, might be falling under multiple means of representation. So if this was the case and I was using literature-based codes or a priori codes, I would then assign that code of multiple means of representation to the parts, words, phrases, or sentences of this response that align with that code. And this is done, so now I've synthesized a chunk of that response rather than having to include the entire passage, right? Multiple sentences or even a few sentences. I just have a few words that explain generally what my participant was talking about. And this, importantly, helps me to look for trends across my participants' responses. My second type of code here falls into a different category. So remember we were talking about before where you've got these codes that happen, that you create before you see your data, before you take a look at that qualitative data. Well, there are also coding approaches, as we mentioned, that happen while you're looking at the data for that first and second time. So we have these descriptive codes, and we typically call them emergent for this first type. So when we talk about emergent codes, we're talking about using our own words to synthesize or describe the broader themes that people are talking about in their responses, right? So in this example here, we have a high school educator talking about the need for professional development. They feel like they're always playing catch up to what others know. So instead of taking the direct quote that says always playing catch up to what others know, I might use an emergent code of my own words to describe what they said. So I might use the words lack of knowledge. In contrast to this type of approach where we're using our own words, we might do something like In-Vivo coding where we're pulling out direct, rich, meaningful descriptions from our participants about what they're doing, instead of assigning our own words or phrases to describe what they're talking about. So in this example here, I might pull out most or all of that quote as an In-Vivo code, and that helps me when I'm going back and doing my data-driven recommendations, in this example here, to pull out some specific areas of professional development or training needs that my participants are talking about, right? So if you were to put a emergent code here, you might put something like lack of knowledge or professional development, right? But when you're making your your data-driven recommendations and you're working on that process, it's important to have, you don't want to go overboard and have too many, but it's important to have a few rich quotes that help you to understand specifically what professional development needs are, what that lack of knowledge is. So in this case, if you see an example like this, which you likely will in your qualitative data, you're going to want to pull out the majority of that, because you see in this example here, and what you might likely see is they're talking about very specific areas of practice that they need help with. So if you're seeing things like that and they're talking about more than one, you want to make sure you pull out all of the sentences that hit on all those different areas of need that they're talking about. Or if it's barriers, right? So whatever that question is, you're going to make sure that you're not missing out on any unique aspects of their response. If they have a response and they're just talking on and on about a particular practice, you don't need to include that entire response, because likely you'd be better off using your own words to describe, right? So if they keep going on and on and on about learning about a specific type of UDL practice, maybe they're talking about the use of visual modalities, right, to supplement audio or text-based, and they just keep talking on and on about that, explaining it, you might just assign the code of visual supports instead of including that entire in-vivo code, because that would be a more effective use of your coding, right? And then you'd likely be able to, rather than having this long drawn-out code that you've pulled, you'd be able to then look how that particular participant aligns with other responses from other participants. So those are our 3 types of codes we'll be using for this class. And with kind of a foundational understanding of what those are, I want to take you through the step-by-step process of coding your qualitative data, which is 5 different steps. And in doing that, we're going to look at some more examples of the 3 different codes and how they can be used together to rigorously analyze and make meaning of your qualitative data in a way that helps you understand your participants' needs, what practices are occurring, when they are, how effective they are, and their recommendations, all in the spirit of making sure that you have a clean analysis that directly informs your data-driven recommendations, to make that process as easy as possible for you and as clean as an objective as possible as it can be. So, step 1 of this 5-step process for making meaning of your qualitative data by using those 3 codes we just talked about is to first look at the practice that's being measured in your open-ended question. So each one of your open-ended questions, which are likely coming after a Likert-based question. So maybe you had a Likert-based question asking how often a particular instructional method is happening. And then you had a open-ended question following up to ask them, so when it happens, effectively, what does that look like? Like, what does effective practice look like for you right now? So if we had that, maybe in my example, I had a question related to soft skills instructional methods. What you want to do is look at your question and identify the practice that's being measured, right? Because just like your research question has an independent variable, we know from developing your questions over the past couple weeks on your program evaluation tool that each one of your questions also has an independent variable of itself, right? So it has that practice that's being measured, that specific evidence-based practice. So the first thing you want to do is identify what that practice is in your open-ended response. And then once you've done that, according to your literature analysis, you're going to look at the specific practices that are associated with that broader category from that step 1. So if you've identified this broader category of practice, so in my example, social skills instructional methods, then I need to look at my literature analysis and look at the specific sub-practices that I had pulled out that are associated with that instructional method. So just kind of going back to some of the examples that we see throughout the semesters, maybe yours is related to transition assessment or family engagement. Let's say transition assessment, right? And you said age-appropriate transition assessment is your overarching practice. And then you broke that down into informal and formal assessments. And maybe you're talking about interest inventories and job evaluation or supervisor evaluations. You're talking about environmental assessments, right? So maybe those are the sub-practices that you broke out. What you would do, whether it's that example or this example here, is you're going to pull out some of those main sub-practices that you're interested in knowing more about, and then turn those into a priori codes. So these, remember, are your literature-based codes. So what we're doing here is, for example, right here in red, you see that I have, in my literature analysis, maybe related to soft skills, instructional methods, I had the use of simulations, right? So maybe, or self-management instruction, or social skills, social stories. So maybe I picked social stories. And I have one of my a priori codes is the use of social stories, right? And then what I would do is look through, as we get into the coding, look through my participants' responses to assign that code of social skills to any instances where social skills are being referenced. The idea being that we'll do that to multiple participants who explain it. So maybe some are talking about social skills for conflict resolution. Some are talking about social stories related to the job interview, right? So there may be these different contexts that they're explaining how social stories are used. And we want to assign that a priori code to those different examples. So this way we have a rich description of what social stories, social books look like across these different experiences and contexts and instructional approaches. So that's step 2, right? So step 1 is we identified the practice that we're measuring in that question. Step 2 is we looked in our literature analysis for the practices that relate to that kind of overarching practice, those sub-practices. We made our a priori codes. In your studies here, you're going to need to have 5 a priori codes. So you're going to have to pull out 5 practices. So what that looks like is you have 5 to 8 practices. Have at least 8 practices for your first article and at least 8 for your second article. So of those 12 or 16 practices that you've identified, you're going to pull out 5 and make those a priori codes. All right, so your step 3, as we were just talking about, is to assign these a priori codes to different aspects of your participant's response. So the way this is going to work is you'll read each participant's response and go one by one, assigning to each of these responses the a priori codes that align to the things that they're talking about. So the codes need to be relevant to some explanation or some practice in there, and the goal is that you are using these a priori codes across these different examples to deeply explain what the characteristic or the practice looks like across these different contexts where it's being used. So multiple a priori codes might be used on the same person's responses, or you might just use one code. So one person might have 3 a priori codes assigned to the different things they were talking about. Other people might not have any. Someone might have 1. That's totally okay. Not every code should apply to every person. You will never find an instance, and you're likely overcoding if you have every participant is meeting all of your codes, and you have everyone having every single code. There might be and likely will be many participants who don't fit any of these a priori codes, and that's where our second type of coding comes in that we'll talk about in a moment, and we've talked about a little bit, is our emergent coding, right? Because we know that by the nature of research and practice and how complicated and diverse instruction is and the things that we're researching, that there's no way that our a priori codes are gonna fit for everyone, and we want to make sure that we don't miss out on all the other things people are talking about. So that's why we use those emergent codes. But we want to make sure that we get a lay of the land first and really align what people are talking about to the literature and evidence-based practices first. So we first look through and we assign any a priori codes to those participants' responses one by one. And then once we've done that, we move on to coding for descriptive codes. So rather than looking at our literature-based codes and putting on different codes to our aspects of our participants' response that align with what we had in our literature analysis, we are either pulling out direct quotes, or we are using our own interpretation, a short word or, a word or a short sentence to explain what our participants are talking about. So in our example here, I have two descriptive codes. I have one that's In-Vivo and then one that's my own interpretation. That's another Emergent code where I've assigned my own words or explanation to what people are talking about in order to summarize it. So for this first one here, I have an In-Vivo code, and I have pulled out a direct quote where the participant was talking about using the principles of UDL to support their CTE programming, and I pulled out the quote, measure the application of their knowledge according to their individual contribution to team-driven inquiry-based projects. So they're talking about group learning, different modalities for action and expression, right? But rather than using a literature-based code, I use this direct quote because it highlights, in this example here, the specific instructional approaches they're using when designing learning opportunities. And then I also have an example of my own short word or sentences, word or short sentences that explain, summarize what the participant's talking about. So in that case, my participant said that we take time to make sure that they not only use the tools that work best for them, but that they learn how to use tools that make them ready for a competitive technology-driven economy. And they're talking specifically about the use of assistive technology and tools for self-management, like timers, organizers, etc. So if my participant's talking about this is a really long quote, and maybe I wanted to summarize it down in a way that helps me look for how this description here relates to the descriptions of practice for other participants. If I want to do that, rather than use this to kind of explain across participants, then I would use my own words, and I might say something like, learning how to use AT beyond the classroom, or learning AT skills that relate to career pathways or jobs or experiences, right? Whatever that looks like. So the important thing to remember is that these 4 steps that we just went through, of first looking at what the practice being measured in your question is, and then looking at your literature analysis for the practices that relate to that overarching practice, and then creating your codes. So that all happens, and then you're going to repeat that process of going in and coding for each of your open response questions. So for each question, you'll be measuring a different practice. So you're going to want to go through each time and identify what the practice is. You're going to want to look in your literature analysis for sub-practices that describe that practice. And then you're going to want to create your codes, and then you'll assign those a priori codes to your participants' responses. And then once you've done that, you'll go in a second time and you'll look for assigning descriptive codes. So maybe that's pulling out In-Vivo codes or assigning your own words or phrases to summarize what they talked about. So you'll complete those 5 steps all the way from identifying the practice to putting in your In-Vivo, your descriptive, and as well as your literature codes for each question. So you repeat those steps 1 through 5 each question. All right, so once you've coded all of your data, the question is, how do you take that kind of from its raw form, because it still is very much in a raw form, right? So you'll have a bulleted list of your participants' responses, and we'll talk about that format at the end. But you'll have this bulleted list of your participants' responses, and then you'll be using a comment feature in Google Google Docs or Microsoft Word to highlight the parts of their responses that relate to either your literature-based or your Emergent codes, right? So maybe they are your own words or In-Vivo. And the question is, how do you make meaning across all these different codes? So the easiest way to do that is, once you have your a priori and your descriptive codes, you're going to want to count how many times each code is used across participants. That is, how many participants have that code for the whole group or a specific group. So many of us are collecting data on different participant groups. So maybe you're looking at about how many times the code was used across teachers versus administrators, or maybe just broadly across all of your participants. So regardless if it's a group or across all participants, you're looking across that entire group or across all participants in general, and you're counting how many times a particular code was used for each person. This is the unique number of instances that the code was used, not that you're not counting like, so for example, if a person had the same code 3 times, that person is coded as 1 time. So we're looking, a good way to think about this is like our frequency response for our Likert questions, that we're trying to get a unique count of how many times something had happened. In this case, how many times that code was used. Just like we would look at how many times a particular response option was chosen on a Likert question. So when you do this, when you count how many times codes happen, then you're able to say things like, so just imagine this ongoing example we have here about supporting diverse learners in CTE. If you're counting all of the codes, you might be able to say something like, when asked about effective approaches being used to support students with disabilities in CTE programming, 50% N equals 10 teachers referred to integrating multiple means of representation into their CTE curriculum and instruction, while 40% N equals 8 of teachers noted attention to multiple means of action and expression within learning activities. And then you might also say, in addition, 10% N equals 2 explained how they teach students how to use high and low-tech assistive technology as a way of supporting diverse learners within CTE curriculum and to prepare them for work afterward. So you see here, just like when we have Likert responses, we go from the highest frequency first to the lowest frequency. So in this case, my highest used code was multiple means of representation. So, and that happened 8 times. So 8 different participants were marked as having that code. Remember that that code could have appeared multiple times within a participant, but I had just identified the unique instances of that code being used. And then I had 2 instances of, on the very end of my frequency here, my 10%, 2 unique instances of them talking about high and low tech assistive technology and supporting that for students. So this is an example of how once you have all of your codes done, so your a priori and your emergent codes, whether they're your own words or phrases assigned to what participants are talking about or direct quotes pulled out, you can take time to quantify the qualitative data. And one thing I want to mention is that you will not be quantifying your in-vivo codes. So you're only going to be quantifying your a priori and your descriptive codes. So it's likely in your coding that as things are emerging, maybe a word that you assigned is being used multiple times, right? So we know that a priori codes, because they've already been made ahead of time and they're all uniform and the same, they'll be used multiple times. But best practice tells us to use descriptive codes over and over, just like we do for the a priori codes. So if you're using the code of assistive technology, you're going to want to use that over and over again to draw themes across your participants and also to be able to count how many times it happens. So you're going to be quantifying only your a priori and your descriptive codes only, none of your in vivo codes. Because in reality, to quantify in vivo codes, so direct quotes, would be impossible because the likelihood of participants saying the exact same thing is highly unlikely. In that case, you would be, you would be kind of misrepresenting or misusing what the codes are at that point in terms of quantifying them, because you can't quantify rich narratives. They really need to stand on their own and to explain their own parts of practice. So a great way to visualize our quantified qualitative results are to graph them. So we know from our quantitative module during this course, we learned how to make graphs, bar charts and line graphs. So in this case, a bar chart or a histogram are the best way for us to do this. So what we're going to do is maybe we're in Microsoft Word, right, and we've pulled out our qualitative data, we could create a chart directly in that Word document. And we would go to our chart menu option, and then click on column, and then we would click on the first option for a 2D clustered column. And then if we did that, we would see a blank chart appear, and we would right click on it and select edit data in Excel. And then if we were using Microsoft Word, obviously, and you have Excel would appear, and at that point you'd be able to input the 3 raw numbers from your total amount of times that code was used uniquely across participants. So how many responses had that code at least once, and put those into the chart. And then you would assign the label for each one of those columns as each one of your codes. So you see here, rather than having like response options from a Likert question, I have all of my different codes. So I have one of them is multiple means of representation, one of them is multiple means of action and expression, and then I have teaching assistive technology skills. This is a great example here of that you don't just have to have your a priori codes on one chart and your descriptive codes on another chart. You can have them both on the same one. So here, multiple means of representation and then multiple means of action and expression are a priori codes in my example, but teaching assistive technology skills is a descriptive code. So here I get to show across my participants. So maybe I just had all teachers and 20 of them. The breakdown visualized of how many times those codes appeared. And that helps us to visualize that multiple means of representation was the most used code across my participants. This is a particularly beneficial thing to do when you're trying to convey a lot of qualitative data and a lot of codes on your transition action brief. So I highly, highly, highly recommend that you quantify your codes, your qualitative codes, and then create 1 or 2 simple bar charts that explain in one bar chart, or maybe 2, your a priori and your descriptive code. So you might have a chart that has both of them together, both a priori and descriptive, or one that has just a priori and another one that has descriptive. Rather than saying that, 45% of participants said that they had selected multiple means of representation, n equals blah, 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 and forward. It's much easier for you to just visualize that in a chart for people. It gives them all the information they need to know. So this is an important thing to do, not just for your analysis, but also for your transition action brief as you move into visualizing your data for your participants. So if I've quantified my qualitative codes in terms of how many unique instances there are of these codes across my participants, whether it be within a group or across my entire sample, that really the question now is, how do we do a final write-up of all of these results in a way that cohesively explains those big overarching themes, that in a way that's both quantitative and qualitative? And we're only talking about our qualitative data here being transformed into quantitative data, but also using that qualitative data as is. So this is called typically an integrated analysis, because we are using both quantitative data, even though it came from qualitative data, and qualitative narratives together to explain some type of experience, in this case how a practice or is being used, whether it's how effective it is, or barriers, or needs for professional development, whatever that is. We're using an integrated analysis here because we're pulling from both worlds. We're pulling from both our quantitative and our qualitative data here. In upcoming modules, we'll talk about integrated analysis in terms of merging this qualitative data and your Likert data, your true quantitative measures that you have collected in your program evaluation tool, but we're not there yet. We're just talking about an integrated approach in terms of all the qualitative data together, synthesizing. So integrated is another way of thinking about synthesizing. So we're synthesizing down in an easy-to-read paragraph the overarching theme for each question. So for every open response question you should have one short paragraph explaining a synthesis of what's going on in terms of all those responses. So with that said, here are some examples and kind of a process of how to do that. So let's say our best practice is we first want to start off with a mix of a priori and emergent descriptive codes. So we might say, when asked about effective approaches being used to support students with disabilities in CTE programming, 50% N equals 10 of teachers referred to integrating multiple means of representation into their CTE curriculum and instruction. So I'm saying that 50% or 10 participants had that code assigned to them, while 40% N equals 8 of teachers noted attention to multiple means of action and expression. So I'm saying that 8 participants had that code assigned to them. And then I have some descriptive codes in that 10% N equals 2 explain how they teach students how to use high and low tech assistive technology, right? So this is the descriptive code. This is not a priori, but I've assigned that as well. And this is that I'm saying that 2 instances happened where I used this descriptive code, and 8 instances happened where I used the code of multiple means of representation, and 2 instances happen, 8 instances happen where I was using the code for multiple means of action and expression. So if I've kind of gone through my first run of a mix of a priori and emergent descriptive codes, the last thing I want to do is look for one or two of those rich descriptive quotes, those in-vivo codes, those quotes, and pull one or two out to help explain one of these codes, one of these either a priori or descriptive codes. So in this case, I used an in-vivo code to explain my descriptive code. So I'm expanding the description, and then I'm using an in-vivo code to give context to what that looks like. So here I have, in describing their attention to multiple means of representation, teachers explained ways in which they create assessments that encourage students to, and in my in-vivo code is I use directly in the sentence inline quote, interact with flexible content that doesn't depend on a single sense like sight, hearing, movement, or touch. So what you want to do for your in-vivo codes is don't say something like participants said and then give the quote. Use the code quote within the context of your explanation. Use it in an inline quote with whatever you're expanding your description of. So just to kind of recap there, we're starting off with giving our a priori codes, our quantified results for how often those codes were used, and then we are using a few emergent descriptive codes to kind of explain additionally above and beyond those literature-based codes what other practices are happening, and then we're expanding our definitions of either those a priori and or those descriptive codes with in-vivo codes. So we're helping that if they're talking about using multiple means of representation, you're providing an inline quote about what that actually looks like. What are they doing? As I had mentioned, best practice and really the easiest way for you to analyze this is to go into Google, into your Google form where your program evaluation tool is, copy and paste all of your qualitative open responses into a Word document, write what the question is, and then do a bulleted list. So each response will be its own bullet. You can do A, B, C, D. You can do just bullet points with circles or whatever you want to do. If you have a lot of responses, you're probably better off using bullet circles or something like that rather than letters or numbers. But you could use numbers as well. And your goal is to break each response out into this format here. So then this way, when you're looking at the document, you can go, oh, okay, here's my first open-ended response question. I know what that practice is. You might highlight the practice within the question itself or write a comment to let yourself know what it is. And then you'll work through using the comment function within Microsoft Word. Or if you're doing this in Google Docs, you could do that too. and highlight and then write the code within that comment. So a good example of this is what we've been doing with our coffee talk and with our comments between each other as we work this semester on your action research organizers. So the same function of using comments like that is how you'll assign your codes, whether they are a priori or they are descriptive codes. Now, if you're doing in-vivo codes, the easiest thing to do is just use the highlight function within your word processor, whether it's Microsoft Word or Google Docs, and highlight the portion of that sentence, or if it's the entire sentence or multiple sentences of that quote, of that direct quote you want to pull out. And that's it for this lecture, but before we do, I just want to go over your homework for this week that'll be due on Sunday. And so what you're going to want to do for homework 2 is download the qualitative data file within the Session 9 folder on Blackboard. And in this document, there are 3 responses to 1 question. So this is data, example data that I've created for you for this homework. It's not real data. For 1 question. And your job is to assign 3 different literature-based codes from the Roe 2015 article. So you need to open up Roe as you do this homework assignment and assign 3 different literature-based codes. So what you want to do is look at the table that we first looked at when we were doing our literature analysis and read through those characteristics of the evidence-based predictors and assign 3 of those evidence-based predictors, those predictor categories. So we have things like transition planning, occupational courses, vocational education, student support, family engagement, right? All those predictors. So you're going to want to make literature-based codes from them or their characteristics. So, you know, within transition planning, they say using age-appropriate transition assessment. So maybe that's what your literature-based code is. But you're going to want to make 3 literature-based codes from that article. And then after you have gone through and assigned those 3 different codes to those 3 responses, you're going to need to do 6 different descriptive codes. So 3 in vivo, so pull out 3 quotes, and then 3 emergent descriptive codes, so your own interpretation, right? So you're going to highlight parts of their responses that relate to 3 literature-based codes that you've picked from the Roe article, and then you're going to identify 6 descriptive codes. So pull out 3 portions of the response as quotes, which could be a few words from their responses, and then 3 descriptive codes that are your own words, that your own interpretation or synthesis of what they're talking about. And then what you're going to do is count how many times the codes that you've identified appear across the 3 responses and write up your quantified results according to the example that we just talked about. You don't need to do a data visualization in the same colors that I've done, but you do need to create a bar chart within Excel that visualize the frequency of your code. So it doesn't need to be in the same font or format as mine, but you do need to make according to how you want to, your own bar chart that visualizes how many times the codes had happened. And it's up to you whether you include a visualization of just the literature-based codes or the descriptive codes. It's up to you which codes that you show. There's no right or wrong for that. It's really just the right or wrong is in that you're displaying them properly. So the counts are the correct way, and the numbers are the correct right, and the codes are listed properly. But you can just visualize the descriptive codes if you like. You can just visualize the literature-based codes, or both if you want to. The idea is to show me that you're able to do that visualization. But you will need to have all of those different codes. So you can choose what you visualize, but you'll have to have those 3 different literature-based codes and those 6 different descriptive codes for your homework. And what I want you to do in terms of this document is take that qualitative data file from Blackboard and do your coding directly in that. So highlight and assign your codes right there. Don't create another document where you like copy paste the in-vivo into a list or something like that. Just highlight and use the comment feature to identify your literature-based codes, and highlight your In-Vivo codes, and then comment feature for your descriptive codes for your own interpretation. And then what you're going to do is create your visualization, create your bar chart directly in that document. So directly in the Word document, make your bar chart. And what you can do is, whether it's Microsoft Word or in Excel, it's much easier to do it in Microsoft Word though. Create your bar chart versus like creating it in Excel and then copying it over. You can just make it directly in Word. It'll be much easier for you. And then just save that document with basically your markup of your different codes and then your chart, and upload that into Blackboard. So you can assign the same code for one or more person's response. And all codes need to be different than the examples that I've shown in the video. So don't just go in and use the codes that I've already shown you. Try to get creative and use your own codes from the row article.